The station smelled like burnt oil and old metal. Vthradoc sat at the far edge of known space, where the stars were thin and the people were thinner. It was the kind of place that existed because someone had to exist there, a floating market, a waypoint, a place where things and people got bought and sold without too many questions. Gra stood in a holding pen near the back of the labor exchange floor. The pen was made of dull gray bars and the floor was cold under her bare feet. She had been standing there for most of the morning. Around her, the noise of the station hummed and rattled, carts rolling past, alien voices mixing together, the distant clank of cargo doors opening and closing. She was the last one left. There had been 6 others in the pen that morning. A tall reptilian male with golden scales had gone first, bought quickly by a mining operation before the auction even properly began. 2 insectoid females had been contracted to a freight company. The others had filtered out one by one until only Gra remained, standing very still, her arms at her sides, her dark green skin catching the pale station light. Gra was an orc. She was 19 years old, broad-shouldered, with heavy hands and sharp yellow eyes. She had a flat nose and a wide jaw, and a smooth lower lip where tusks should have been. In Orcish culture, tusks were everything. They marked strength. They marked standing. They were the first thing an orc looked at when sizing up another orc. Gra had none. She had been born without them, which her clan had taken as a sign of weakness or bad luck or both. By the time she was 12, the elders had stopped calling her by her name in public. By the time she was 17, she had been sent to work on the lower levels of their outpost, away from the rest of the clan. When the clan elder had sold her contract to a labor broker 6 months ago, no one had protested. Now she was here. And no one wanted her. Alien buyers had passed her pen all morning. A few had stopped and looked at the datasheet attached to the bar: age, species, health rating, skill set, contract terms. Most of them moved on quickly. Orcish workers had a reputation for being difficult, and Gra had no skills listed beyond basic labor. A couple of orc buyers had stopped as well, taken one look at her smooth jaw, and walked away without a word. One had actually laughed. Vesh, the auctioneer, was a wiry insectoid with 4 arms and a long neck that swiveled in ways that made Gra slightly uneasy. He had been patient all morning, but she could tell his patience was running out. He tapped 2 of his 4 arms together, a nervous habit she had noticed, and glanced at her with his flat, compound eyes. He was about to send her down to the lower labor pools. She knew what that meant. The lower pools were where contracts went when no one wanted them. Maintenance tunnels. Waste processing. Work that no one else would take. Gra kept her eyes forward and said nothing. The man came in through the east door, which was the cargo entrance. He was human. She had seen humans before, though not many, and he was covered in the fine gray dust that settled on everyone who spent time near the loading bays. He was tall, not particularly large, with dark hair going gray at the sides and a face that looked like it had spent a lot of time outside in weather that didn't care what it did to a person. He wore a worn brown jacket and carried a small handheld scanner. He walked straight to the databoard and began reading. He was not in a hurry. He read each listing carefully, scrolling with his thumb, occasionally tapping to pull up more detail. Vesh drifted toward him with the practiced ease of someone who had learned exactly how much to hover. The man reached Gra's listing. He read it. He read the whole thing, which most people had not. Then he looked up from the scanner and looked directly at Gra. Not at her jaw. Not at the empty space below her lower lip. He looked at her face, the way a person looks at another person when they are actually trying to see them. He walked to the pen. Vesh floated alongside him, already preparing his professional smile. The man looked at Gra through the bars. He asked, "Can you cook?" Vesh opened his mouth to answer. The man held up a hand without looking at him. Gra stared. No one had asked her anything directly in 6 months. Buyers did not ask contracted workers questions. They asked the brokers. They asked the data sheets. She had stood in this pen all morning being talked about, pointed at, and passed over, and not one person had spoken to her. She answered him honestly. "No," she said. Her voice was low and flat from disuse. "But I learn fast." The man nodded once, like that was a reasonable thing to say. Then he turned to Vesh and said, "I'll take her contract. What's the full term?" Vesh told him. The man looked at the numbers, asked one question about the renewal clause, and then signed. The whole thing took less than 4 minutes. Gra watched the man complete the paperwork. She did not feel relieved. She did not feel hopeful. She had learned not to spend feelings on things that had not happened yet. But she watched him, and she noticed that he had not laughed at her jaw, and he had not called her by her species like it was an insult, and she filed both of those things away somewhere quiet inside herself. The bars opened. Vesh handed her a copy of the contract chip and told her the terms in a flat voice. 3-year contract, full room and board, standard colonial labor protections, renewable by mutual agreement. The man was already walking toward the cargo exit. He glanced back once to check she was following. "My name is Cal," he said, when she caught up. "We've got a transport leaving in 2 hours. Duran 4 is about a day and a half out." "What is Duran 4? She asked. "Home," he said. And that was all he said about it. Gra followed him through the station toward the docks, past food stalls and merchant carts and clusters of travelers from a dozen different species. No one paid them much attention. In a place like Vthradoc, a human walking with a tuskless orc was not the strangest thing anyone had seen that day. She did not know where she was going. She did not know this man. She had learned, from her clan, from 6 months of contract brokers, from a long morning in a grey pen, that not knowing was simply the normal condition of her life. But she had been asked a question directly, and she had answered, and someone had listened. It was a small thing. But small things, she was beginning to understand, were sometimes all there was. Duran 4 was not what Gra had expected, mostly because she had not let herself expect anything. The transport broke through the cloud cover at mid-morning, and the moon came into view below, wide and flat and brown-orange, with patches of dark green near the water channels and a sky that sat somewhere between copper and gray. It was not beautiful in the way that she had heard some worlds were beautiful. It was wide and quiet, and it looked like a place that did not care about being looked at. Cal had slept for most of the journey in the transport's small passenger hold. He slept like someone who was used to sleeping wherever there was room and waking up when there was work to do. Gra had not slept. She had sat with her back against the hull and watched the stars through the small port window and thought about nothing in particular, which was easier than thinking about the things she might need to think about later. The homestead came into view as the transport dropped toward the landing pad, a cluster of low buildings behind a windbreak of engineered shrubs, a storage structure to one side, a power array on a ridge to the east catching the pale light. It was not small, but it was not large either. It was a working place. Everything about it looked like it had a reason to be where it was. Cal led her off the transport and across the yard without ceremony. He pointed out the water recycler, the generator housing, the storage unit where cold supplies were kept. He spoke plainly and not too fast, and he did not repeat himself. Then the front door opened and the 5 children came out. They came out all at once, which meant they had been watching through the window. The oldest one, a boy of about 14 with dark eyes and his father's jaw, stopped on the steps and looked at Gra the way that someone looks at a problem they have not finished solving. The girl behind him, who looked about 11, pushed past him immediately and came down to the yard without hesitation, looking up at Gra with direct brown eyes. The next one was a boy of about 9. He had a notebook pressed to his chest, and he stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at her with the quiet, careful attention of someone who was already memorizing the details. Behind him was a small girl, maybe 6, with short hair and muddy boots. She walked straight up to Gra, reached out both hands, and put them flat on Gra's forearm. "You're very green," she said, in a tone of complete scientific approval. The last one was a small boy who had to be helped down the last step by his father, who had appeared at the door. He looked at Gra and then put his face against Cal's leg. Cal rested a hand on the boy's head. He introduced them in order: Lou, the oldest, then Penny, then Dex with a notebook, then Mara who was still holding Gra's arm, then Owen against his leg. None of them said welcome. Lou said nothing at all. Penny asked immediately how tall Gra was and whether orcs could see in the dark. Dex opened his notebook and wrote something down. Mara dropped her hands and went back inside. Owen stayed against Cal's leg. Cal showed Gra to her room. It was small and plain, a bed, a shelf, a window that looked out over the yard, but it was clean and warm and there was a lock on the inside of the door. He told her the house ran on an early schedule. Breakfast was expected. The children needed to be at their learning terminals by the 8th hour. There were chores assigned to each child, but they needed supervision or they would forget. He told her she would figure out the rest as she went. He was right that she would figure it out. He did not mention that figuring it out would involve burning the first 3 meals. The first morning she made something she had learned called grain porridge, and it came out gray and thick and completely flavorless. Penny told her directly that it tasted like paste. Lou ate it without comment, which was somehow worse. Dex drew something in his notebook. Mara poured her bowl into the yard for the insects. Owen cried, though he cried about other things too, so it was hard to know if the food was the cause. Cal ate all of his without complaint and thanked her. The second and third meals were not much better. Gra studied the household food system at night when the children were asleep, reading through stored recipe files and watching short instructional clips. She had told the man she learned fast. She intended to be honest about that. Lou watched her. Not in the way that Mara watched her, which was openly and without self-consciousness. Lou watched her the way someone watches a thing they haven't decided about yet. He did his chores and he looked after his younger siblings without being asked, and every time Gra was in the room, he was aware of her in that careful, tense way that teenagers have when they are trying not to show that they are paying attention. She did not push against it. She simply worked. On the 5th night, Owen woke up screaming from a nightmare. Cal was outside running a check on the power cells because the East array had been reading wrong all day. Gra heard the crying from her room and came out into the hallway, and found Owen sitting on the floor in the dark, gasping and shaking with the particular terror of a 4-year-old who has been somewhere horrible and cannot yet get back to safe ground. She stood in the hallway and looked at him. She did not know what to do. She had not been raised with softness. In her clan, children who cried were told to stop. But she could not say that to this child. It did not seem right to say that here. So she sat down on the floor next to him instead. She did not touch him. She just sat there, in the dark hallway, close enough that he could feel she was there. After a while his breathing slowed down. After a longer while he leaned over and put his head against her arm. After a longer while than that he was asleep. She stayed where she was. When Cal came in from outside, he found them both asleep in the hall. His smallest son curled against the arm of a Tuskless orc who had come in on the transport 2 days ago. He stood there for a moment in the doorway, still wearing his jacket, covered in the dust of the yard. He didn't say anything. He got a blanket from the cupboard and draped it over Owen, and then he went to bed. Gra woke up an hour later on her own and went back to her room. But when she lay down she was aware that something had happened that she did not have a name for yet, some small transaction she had not been prepared for. She had sat on a cold floor in the dark with a crying child because it had seemed like the only decent thing to do, and something about the doing of it had made her feel, briefly, like she was somewhere she was supposed to be. She filed that feeling away carefully, in the same quiet place where she had put the fact that the man had spoken to her directly and not laughed at her jaw. It was a growing collection. 3 weeks in, Gra could cook 7 meals without burning any of them. She had worked through the recipe files methodically, practicing each one in the early morning before the children woke up, adjusting for the ingredients available in the homestead stores. The grain porridge was now something that Penny described as acceptable, which Gra had come to understand was high praise from that particular child. Mara had asked for more of the vegetable stew twice. Even Lou had stopped eating with that particular silence that meant he was suffering through the food politely. The house had settled into its rhythms, and Gra had settled into them too. She knew which children needed reminding about their learning terminals and which one needed only to be looked at. She knew that Dex liked to work in the corner near the east window and would not be disturbed if you simply did not look at him directly. She knew that Mara could be trusted to carry light things but not fragile things, and that Owen had strong feelings about the order in which his boots went on. She was still learning Cal, but Cal was not an easy person to learn. He was consistent in a way that she had never seen in an adult before. He did not have good moods and bad moods in the way that other people did. He was quiet, mostly, and he worked constantly, and when he said something he meant it, and when he was wrong about something he said so without much drama. He had asked Gra once, in the second week, whether her room was warm enough, and when she said it ran cold in the night, he had fixed the heating element the same evening without making anything of it. She found this behavior puzzling and could not entirely stop thinking about it. It was Penny who brought up the tusks. She did it the way she did most things, directly and without any particular cruelty, Just a question that had been sitting in her head for a while and needed to come out. They were in the kitchen, Gra washing the midday dishes and Penny sitting on the counter doing her language homework in the distracted way she did everything. She looked up from her tablet and said, "How come you don't have tusks? All the orc pictures I've seen have tusks." Gra kept washing the dish she was washing. "I was born without them." "Does that happen a lot?" "No." Penny thought about this. "Is that why your clan sold you?" "Yes," Gra said. "In Orcish culture, tusks mean strength and standing. Without them, you have neither. A tuskless orc is considered bad luck. Weak bloodline. The clan does not want that close to them." Penny was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard," in a flat, completely sincere voice, and went back to her homework. Gra stood at the sink and looked at the water running over her hands. She did not know why those 7 words had done what they did to something in her chest. It was not as if she had not known that the logic of her clan was arbitrary and cruel. She had known that for years. But knowing a thing inside yourself and hearing someone else say it plainly, without anger, just as a fact, those were different things. She finished the dishes and said nothing, and Penny never mentioned it again, which was somehow the most respectful response possible. 2 weeks later, a convoy of Keth traders stopped near the homestead to negotiate a supply trade with Cal. The Keth were tall and narrow, pale-skinned, with long fingers and an elaborate social language built around status display. They did most of their business outdoors and stood in small precise clusters while they talked. Gra was working in the yard when the convoy pulled in. She kept working. One of the Keth traders, the one who appeared to be managing the negotiation, passed close to her. He said something in Keth to his companion. Gra spoke enough Keth to understand it. It was a remark about her jaw, phrased as a joke. His companion made a sound that was the Keth equivalent of a laugh. She went still for a moment. Then she kept working. Cal noticed. He did not understand Keth, but he had been watching the yard with the low-level attention that he gave to everything in his immediate environment, and he saw the way she went still and then deliberately went back to what she was doing. When the Keth convoy left an hour later, Cal came across the yard to where Gra was stacking supply crates. He stood nearby and said, without preamble, "What did they say?" She told him. She translated it flat and exact, the way she had learned to translate, without adding anything to it or taking anything away. Cal was quiet for a moment. He looked out toward the road where the convoy had gone. Then he said, "They don't know you. What they think doesn't count." He said it the way he said most things, not as comfort exactly, more as a statement of observable fact. Then he picked up one of the crates and carried it to the storage unit. Gra stood there for a moment. She thought about that sentence. She had heard similar things before, usually from people who meant them kindly but said them in a way that still left a residue of pity. Cal had said it the way he would have said that the East array was reading wrong or that it was going to rain, like it was simply true and didn't need anything more added to it. It sat differently that way. It was Lou who finally said something to her directly, about 3 weeks after that. He found her alone in the storage unit doing an inventory check one evening while the younger children were inside. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, and he said what had clearly been sitting in him for a while. He told her she wasn't family. He told her she was a contract, and that when the contract ended she would leave, and she shouldn't act like she was part of something she wasn't part of. Gra kept counting the supply canisters. She didn't stop what she was doing. When she had finished the row she was on, she said, "I know I'm not family. I'm not trying to be." She looked at him then. "I'm contracted to run this house and look after the 5 of you. I'm going to do that whether you like me or not, because I said I would and I don't break agreements. That's all this is." Lou looked at her for a long moment. He didn't have anything to say to that, which was because there wasn't anything to say to it. He left. The next morning he brought his breakfast plate to the kitchen without being asked. He had never done that before. It was a small thing, and he did not look at her while he did it, but she noticed and she filed it in her quiet internal collection of small things that turned out to matter. That same afternoon Dex came to find her in the yard. He stopped a few feet away and held out his notebook, open to a page near the middle. Gra took it and looked. He had been drawing her for weeks, she realized. There were a dozen small sketches, her at the sink, her carrying crates, her sitting on the floor of the hallway in the dark with Owen. In none of the drawings was she depicted as something strange or frightening. She was just there, part of the ordinary scenery of the house, the same way the table was there and the window was there. She handed the notebook back to him. She did not know what to say that would be worth saying. Dex took it back, looked at the drawings himself for a moment with his usual serious expression, and then went inside. Gra stood in the yard in the thin orange light of Durin, and thought, not for the first time, that humans were very strange. They said the important things sideways. They put them in drawings and in flat sentences about what did and didn't count. They did not make speeches. They just kept showing up and behaving like you were there. She was beginning to think that might be the most powerful thing she had ever encountered. The ion storm came in from the west without much warning. Cal had checked the weather relay that morning, and it had shown a moderate front moving through, the kind that happened 3 or 4 times a season on Durin. Some interference, some wind, nothing the homestead couldn't handle. By early afternoon it was clear the relay had been wrong. The sky turned a deep bruised color and the wind picked up hard and fast, and by the time Cal had gotten the children inside and sealed the exterior panels, the storm was already loud. Ion storms on terraformed moons were not like rain. They came with a static charge that built in the air and made the back of your neck feel tight, and they interfered with electronics in unpredictable ways. The communication array went down first, a sharp crackle and then nothing. Then the lights flickered and the heating grid in the children's wing of the house began to fail, dropping by degrees as the power cells struggled against the draw from the storm's interference. Cal checked the readings on the main panel and told Gra he needed to go out and manually reroute power from the auxiliary cells on the ridge. It was the only way to keep the house warm. The storm would last 6 to 8 hours based on the look of it, which meant the children needed the heat. He looked at her for a moment before he went out. "You'll be all right," he said. It was somewhere between a question and a statement, the way he sometimes said things when he trusted someone to give him an honest answer. "Yes," she said. He put on his heavy jacket and went out into the wind, and she heard the door seal behind him. The 5 children were in the main room. She could hear them before she got there. The storm made a sound against the walls that was not entirely comfortable, and the lights were dimmer than usual, and 5 children ranging from 4 to 14 had a collective emotional weather system all their own. Owen was already crying softly, pressed into the corner of the large chair with his blanket. Mara was standing at the window watching the storm with her arms crossed, pretending to be unbothered. Penny was sitting on the floor with her tablet, but she wasn't reading it, she was just holding it. Dex was in his corner with his notebook, but his pencil wasn't moving. Lou was standing near the back wall with his arms crossed, and Gra could tell from the way his jaw was set that he was frightened and was working very hard not to show it. She stood in the doorway of the main room and looked at them. She was not a natural comforter. She had not been raised with warmth. She did not have the easy, practiced manner of someone who had spent years soothing children through difficult moments. She had been managing this household for 2 months, and she had learned its rhythms, but she was still, in many ways, finding her footing. But she was here and Cal was not, and the children were here, and the storm was loud. She made a decision. She told them to bring every blanket in the house to the main room. She said it in the flat, practical tone that worked best with the hardened children. Not a request, not a warm invitation, just a clear instruction that assumed they would do it. Mara moved immediately. Penny set down her tablet and got up. Dex closed his notebook. Owen peeled himself out of the chair. Even Lou, after a moment's pause, went down the hall to the linen shelf. They piled the blankets in the middle of the main room floor, and Gra arranged them in a way that was less of a neat stack and more of a nest. She sat down in the middle of it. Owen climbed in immediately and pressed against her side. Mara sat near her feet. Penny sat across from her, cross-legged, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Dex sat at the edge. Lou sat last, against the far wall, close enough to be part of the circle, but with enough distance to maintain his position on the matter. The room was warmer with all of them together. The storm was still loud, but the walls held, and the emergency light in the ceiling gave off a low amber glow. Penny said, "Tell us something." Gra looked at her. "A story," Penny said. "Tell us a story. Dad tells us stories when the power goes out." Gra did not know human stories. She knew Orcish ones, long war sagas, most of them, full of battles and tusk glory and the kind of violence that was supposed to be inspiring. They were not stories for children, not exactly, and most of the things they celebrated were things she had personal reasons to find hollow. But she knew the shapes of them. She knew how they moved. So she began to tell one, and as she told it, she changed it. She kept the setting, the dark edge of the world, the long cold march, the enemy that seemed too large to face. But the hero she described was not a warrior with great tusks and a famous bloodline. The hero she described was someone who had no particular advantage. Someone who kept going not because they were the strongest, but because they were the most stubborn, and because they had decided that the people behind them mattered more than the fear in front of them. She did not plan it. It came out that way on its own. Owen fell asleep first, still pressed against her arm. Then Mara, curled up near her feet like a small animal. Penny lasted longer, listening with her chin in her hand, but her eyes closed somewhere in the middle of the third act. Dex fell asleep sitting up and slowly tipped sideways. Only Lou stayed awake, still in his place against the wall, and when Gra reached the end of the story and let her voice trail off into quiet, he was looking at the floor with an expression she could not quite name. He didn't say anything, but he didn't get up and leave either. Cal came back at the third hour of the night, half frozen, his jacket wet from the storm, power restored. He came through the door and stopped. All 5 of his children were asleep in a pile of blankets in the middle of the main room. Gra was sitting in the center of them, upright and awake, her back against the base of the couch. The amber light made everything look soft. Owen had not moved from her side. Cal stood there in the doorway for a long moment. Then he took off his jacket and hung it up. He got a blanket from the hall. He sat down in the chair across the room and pulled the blanket over himself and did not wake anyone. In the morning the storm was gone. The sky was clear and pale, and the yard was scattered with debris from the wind. Gra made breakfast, and everyone came to the table with the slow, blinking warmth of people who slept well by accident. Lou sat down and looked at his bowl. Then he said, without looking up, "Gra, can you put more of that spice in this? The red one." It was the first time he had called her by name. She put in the red spice. No one made anything of it. The morning went on. 3 days later, when the communication array was back online, a message came in through the colonial relay. The sender was logged as the Orcish Clan Registry, Eastern Outpost Division. The subject line read, "Contract Dispute, Recall Request." Cal read it twice at the kitchen table after the children were in bed. Then he set the tablet down and sat very still for a moment in the way he sat when he was thinking through something he intended to take seriously. He looked at Gra, who was washing the last of the dishes. "I need to read some things tonight," he said. "I'll explain in a few days." She looked at him. "Is it about me?" "Yes." She nodded and went back to the dishes. She did not ask anything else. She had learned that when Cal said he would explain something, he did. She was not yet afraid. But she was aware, in the way she had learned to be aware of things, that the quiet she had been living inside for 2 months had just changed its shape. Cal spent 2 nights reading. He did it after the children were in bed, at the kitchen table, with a mug of coffee that he kept refilling and a patience for legal documentation that Gra would not have guessed at if she had not seen it herself. He had pulled up the full text of the recall message and every linked regulation and cross-referenced statute. He had contacted a frontier legal advisory service through the Colonial Relay, a small outfit that operated out of a station 3 systems over, and paid their consultation fee without comment. He did not tell Gra what he was finding. He had told her he would explain in a few days, and so she waited, and she kept the house running, and she did not show the children that anything had changed. Children always sensed when something was being managed, and the best thing she could do was make the ordinary things feel ordinary for as long as possible. She found out what the recall message actually said on the 3rd day, when Cal sat down across from her at the kitchen table after the children had gone to bed. He had the tablet in front of him, and he turned it so she could read the message herself. She read it once quickly and then again slowly. Her former clan was claiming that the original labor contract had not been properly authorized, that the elder who signed the sale had not held the standing to do so, because he had been subject to a clan leadership challenge at the time. Under interspecies commerce law, they argued, this made the contract invalid. They were requesting that Gra be returned to Orcish jurisdiction for clan reprocessing, which was a formal term for something she did not want to think about too hard. She put the tablet down. She looked at the table. Cal said, "The contract is valid." She looked up. He explained it plainly. The elder who had signed her sale had held recognized legal authority under colonial commerce law at the time of signing, regardless of any internal clan dispute. Internal Orcish succession politics did not retroactively invalidate a contract registered with a colonial commerce office. The Frontier Legal Service had confirmed this twice. The recall had no legal standing under the framework that governed labor contracts in this sector. Gra was quiet for a moment. "So they can't take me back?" "Not on the grounds they filed," Cal said. "And they'd need to file through the colonial arbitration system to try any other approach, which takes time and money, and they'd need a lawyer willing to take the case to a sector court. That's a significant amount of effort for a contract worker they didn't want in the first place." There was a silence. "That's not all," Cal said. He turned the tablet back toward himself and pulled up a second document. He pushed it back to her. It was a filing. She read the header. It was a residential dependent status application, submitted to the Duran 4 Colonial Registry 2 days ago. Her name was in the application. Cal's homestead registration number was there. The date was from the night after he first read the recall message. She read it again. Under colonial resettlement law, a contracted individual who had resided on a registered homestead for a continuous qualifying period could be granted residential dependent status, meaning legal recognition as a member of the household unit. It came with residential protections. It meant that any external claim on that person had to go through the colonial court, not the species jurisdiction shortcut the clan had been hoping to use. He had filed it before she even knew there was a problem. Gra set the tablet down on the table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Cal. "Why?" she said. Cal thought about it for a moment in the way he thought about things, not as if he was figuring out what to say, but as if he was finding the right words for something he already knew. "You got my kids through a bad storm," he said. "You show up every morning. You do what you say you're going to do." He looked at her directly. "And you don't deserve to be dragged back to people who sold you because you were born without something they valued. That's not a good reason to do anything to anyone." He said it the way he said most things. Not like he was trying to be kind. Like it was simply obvious. Gra did not cry. Orcs did not cry easily. It wasn't in the physiology, not really, not in the way humans did. But she was very still for a long moment, and something in the back of her throat was tight, and she looked at the tablet on the table rather than at him. After a while she said, "The filing. Does it go through?" The registry confirmed receipt. Processing takes about 2 weeks on this moon. Standard timeline. He picked up his mug. In the meantime, the application itself gives you interim protection. They can't do anything while it's in process. She nodded. He nodded back. They sat at the table for a little while longer without saying anything, which was comfortable in the way that silence between people is comfortable when neither person needs the silence to end. Then Cal said he was going to bed, and he went. Gra sat at the table alone for a while. She thought about her clan's outpost, the gray corridors, the low-level work, the way people had stopped saying her name. She thought about the holding pen on Vthradoc and the long morning of being looked at and passed over. She thought about a man who came through a cargo entrance covered in dust and read a data sheet all the way to the end and asked her a question and listened to the answer. She thought about Lou saying her name for the first time over breakfast. About Dex's notebook full of drawings of someone who was simply there. About Owen asleep with his face against her arm in the dark. She got up and washed Cal's mug and left it on the rack and went to bed. 2 weeks later the confirmation came through the relay. Residential dependent status. Approved. Nobody made a speech about it. Cal told her over breakfast, between telling Penny to stop reading at the table and checking that Dex had his boots on before going outside. He said the confirmation came in and the processing was done, and that was that. Mara asked what residential dependent meant. Cal said it meant Gra was officially part of the household on paper, same as the rest of them. Mara thought about that for a moment and then went back to eating. The morning was like every other morning. It was cold and bright outside, and the Easter Ray was reading properly for once, and the coffee was mediocre, and all 5 children needed to be somewhere they were not yet. Gra braided Mara's hair at the table, a human custom she had learned from watching a hairstyling video with Penny one afternoon, practiced until she was better at it than Penny, while Mara sat on her feet for warmth. Across the table, Dex opened his notebook to a fresh page. He drew for a few minutes with the focused quiet that he always had. Then he turned the notebook around and showed it to the table. He had drawn all 7 of them. The kitchen, the table, the window with a pale light coming through. Cal with his mug. Penny with her tablet. Lou looking at something outside the frame. Owen asleep with his head on the table. Mara sitting on Gra's feet. Gra was in the middle of it. Not at the edge. Not slightly apart. In the middle, the same as everyone else, drawn with the same simple lines as the chairs and the window and the people she had come to know. Nobody said anything about it. Penny told Lou to pass the grain, and he did, and outside on Duran, for the sky was its usual copper gray and the wind was low and the power array on the ridge was working just fine. The day started the way all the best days do, without ceremony, without announcement, just the ordinary weight of a morning that belonged to all of them equally.